somebody else's in Africa or anywhere else. The plundering of the forest in 1776, the wealth of forests in North America was beyond belief. Within 200 years, in fact 150 years, it had been destroyed, or more than 90% of it wasted, and it had in it 300 years of accumulated capital savings and investment of sunlight and the fertility of the soil. And now that our bread is going to have 5 times as much fiber, by making it out of sawdust, we're going to go on plundering the forest to a larger degree, which of course is one of the reasons I am sure that President Ford 2 days ago signed the new bill which allows clear cutting in the national forest. Because we need that roughage or fiber in our bread. Having taken all the natural fiber out of the wheat, of course, and thrown it away. The energy which gave us the Industrial Revolution, coal, oil, natural gas, represented the accumulated savings of 3 weeks of sunlight that managed somehow to be saved in the earth out of 3 billion years of sunshine. Because that's what the fossil fuels are. This is not income to be spent. This is capital to be saved and invested. And we have now destroyed into what we call entropy, that is into a form of energy which is no longer possible to be utilized. We have now destroyed into entropy 11 or 12 days of that accumulated 21 days of sunlight. And we have wasted it. For example, we have changed our agricultural system, which used to be a system in which seed was put into the earth to take sunlight, rain, and the wealth of the soil to create food, and we have replaced it with an agricultural system which is entirely capital intensive, has eliminated labor, has eliminated land to a very considerable extent, so that we pour out what we call food is now a chemical synthetic. And we've done that by putting into a smaller and smaller amount of soil a larger and larger amount of chemicals made out of fossil fuels. Just to give you one figure, every bushel of corn which is sent to the Russians represents 1 gallon of gasoline. And they say that we are getting, by selling our grain to the Russians, we are getting the foreign exchange which will allow us to pay for the petroleum at $14 a barrel that we're bringing in. Nobody ever stops to look at how many gallons did you get to send this to the Russians. Do you sell the millions of bushels, which represents millions of gallons? From 1940 to 1970, and I put this in to indicate to you how our whole system is destroying communities. Much of the legislation of the last 40 years in this country has been aimed at the destruction of families neighborhoods, ghettos, parishes, or anything else. In 30 years, from 1940 to 1970, 3 million American farms were abandoned because the people who worked on them with their families could not compete with the corporation farmers using the new chemical methods of producing crops. 30 million people left these abandoned farms and rural areas and went into the town and into the cities. Many of them, millions certainly, to get on the lease. In 1970, the last year books I have any reliable figures, 2,000 farms a week are going out of production. These are the farms on which we brought up your grandparents, the people who won the Civil War, indeed the people who fought in the First War, and in many cases even in the Second War. Will the tractors be able to fight the next war when there are no more farm boys to fight? Well, of course, whether they're farm boys or not, they won't want to fight. 800,000 rural people each year in 1970 were leaving rural areas and moving into town and being replaced by corporations. In the same way, by urban renewal and other things in the cities, we are destroying communities. The fundamental cause of world instability today, and it's all pervasive, is the destruction of communities by commercialization of all human relationships with resulting neuroses and psychoses. The technological increase and speeding up of transportation, communication, and weapon systems is creating power areas today wider than existing political structures. You still have half a dozen at least political structures in Europe, but the power system of our technology and Western civilization today as it exists is such that most of Europe should be a single power system. Therefore, this is instability. Medical science and the population explosion have continued to produce people and people when the supply of food and the supply of jobs are increasingly precarious, not just in the United States, but everywhere. Because the whole purpose of using fossil fuels and the corporate structure is to eliminate jobs. Labor savings, we call it, as if there was something wrong with working. Working is one of the joys of life. And if we have created a society in which working is a pain in the neck, then we have created a society which is not fit for human beings. It will be obvious to you that I have enjoyed my work and enjoyed it here. Although at the end of my career, I have no conviction that I did any good. Fortunately, I had a marvelous parent and a marvelous mother. And we were taught, you don't have to win, but you have to give it all you've got. Then it won't matter. Now, to get back to the structure of the state and sovereignty, we now have a society in America, but in Europe and much of the world, which is totally dominated by the two elements of sovereignty which were not included in the state structure. control of banking and credit, and the corporations. These are three of political controls. They have now largely monopolized power in Western civilization and in our society without social responsibility, and are ruthlessly going forward to eliminate land, labor, entrepreneurial, managerial skills, and everything else which the economists once told us were the chief elements of production. And the only element of production that they are concerned with is the one that they can control: capital. So everything now is capital intensive, including medicine. And it hasn't worked. I'll just give you one figure. Nobody has a more capital intensive medical system than that of the United States, and many of you may be well satisfied with it. I simply want to point out a couple of facts. When a boy baby is born in the United States, his expectation of life is less than that in 19 other countries in the world. And it's that good only because while our infant mortality rate is not good, it is better than our adult mortality rate. In other words, in infant mortality, we are not the best. We're about 9th or 10th. These figures are about 1970 is true, I think. Let us look at a man, a boy, 10 years old in the United States today. His expectation of life is less than that of 30 other countries, according to the United Nations statistics. Now, we're paying more than anybody in those 30 countries are paying for a capital-intensive medical system devoted to keeping people who are almost dead alive a few more days, instead of making people grow up healthy by teaching them that work is fun, by teaching them that they don't have to be gluttons, that with moderation, I mean, we all, in the United States, more than half our food is wasted. And that may be because it isn't that good. Exercise, moderation, and so forth. It's all the old stuff we used to get in Sunday school. It just happens to be correct. Now, I come to a topic of delicacy. The U.S. constitutional crisis. The three branches of government set up in 1789 does not contain the 8 aspects of sovereignty. It left out completely, for example, the administrative power. The result is that ever since, the three branches of government have been struggling to decide which of them will control the administrative power. The growth of political parties was necessary to establish relationships between the three branches. Changes in the processes of nomination for elections. I used to tell my students, it doesn't matter who votes in an election. The important thing is the nomination. And when you come to the election, it doesn't matter who votes. What's important is who didn't vote. Every election in the United States, and increasingly so, is determined by the people who didn't vote. And they're turned off for various reasons. As a result of three branches they were set up, they've all tried to go outside of the spheres in which they should be restrained. Walking over here with the dean and Professor Brown, we spoke briefly about the Latin school that I went to. The oldest school in the United States, 1635, preparatory school. Harvard was created the next year as a place for Latin school boys to go to. And in my day, it was the largest single source of supply. My day would be 1929, 1930. It was the largest single source of supply, although Harvard was doing everything they could to cut down on the Latin school boys. But the chief method that they tried to cut us down was by raising the requirements for us, and we could handle that. But today, that school is controlled by a judge in Boston who has taken it upon himself to tell the school who will be admitted. And he has said, you must have so many girls, you must have such percentage of blacks, and so forth and so forth and so forth. And if they do not meet, and you cannot have entrance exams, and if people fail, you can't throw them out. And what was once an absolutely incredible preparatory school had many drawbacks. It was murderous. But it could get any students into any competitive system of entrance in the country. In numbers, but the university in question didn't warn. Now, one of the flaws in our, and to me the most ominous one in our constitutional setup, the fact that the federal government does not have control of money and credit, does not have control of corporations. It is therefore not really sovereign, and it is not really responsible, because it is now controlled exactly by those two groups. Those who control flows of money and corporations. The new public financing of the presidency is arranged so that they can spend as much as they want. Voluntary contributions to elect someone that he has not authorized is legal. The President of the United States, when I look at him, as he exists, what young Schlesinger, that's Art Schlesinger Jr., called the imperial presidency, what I see is Caesar Augustus. He is commander-in-chief. That's what imperator, emperor, means. He's the head of the executive branch. He's the head of the state, as well as head of the executive branch and these other things. Head of the state means he's the representative of the United States government in all foreign affairs, and all ambassadors are accredited to him, and so forth. Fourthly, he's the head of the political party. Fifth, he's head of the administrative system, which is increasingly making all the decisions. What will be spent and who will spend it in the Bureau of Budget and Management, and the system in England is even worse. The Parliament in England no longer has any control at all over expenditure. And yet they're still teaching in the schools that that is how they got the English Constitution, by control of grants to the monarchy. Do you know who's making the decisions in the Bureau of Budget and Management as to who will get how much? And he is also the symbol of national unity, the focus of our emotional feelings regarding our country. This is why it's so difficult to get rid of an incumbent president, either by election or by impeachment. But there are other reasons. We we have a general paralysis of government in the United States today, especially the administrative power, by the very things that we praise, the so-called rule of law, which should rather be called the rule of lawyers. Let me give you one example. It is perfectly clear in the U.S. Constitution that a president can be impeached by a vote of the Congress, indictment by the House, conviction by the Senate. It does not require common law procedures. It does not require judicial process. It is not a judicial action at all. It is a simple political action. If you have the vote, he can be removed simply by counting. The horrible thing about the whole Nixon business is that impeachment will never be used again in the history of the United States. Because the lawyers in Congress, imagine, every member of the Judiciary Committee has to be a lawyer. And the Judiciary Committee has to recommend that he be impeached. And have to do all kinds of things that you might do in a court of law if you're accused of holding up a bank. And the result is that never again will anybody attempt to impeach a president. It would take years, be indecisive, when you could simply have had a vote do the whole thing in one morning, which is the way it was intended. Now, there's a lot of other inventions in the Constitution which are perfectly obvious, but I can't get any constitutional lawyer to agree with me. It's perfectly obvious from the Constitution that if the three branches of government couldn't agree, don't do it. That's what the theory was. No, we have to have somebody supreme. The court will make the ultimate decision from it. I'll just touch upon something else, secrecy in government. Secrecy in government exists for only one reason: to prevent the American people from knowing what's going on. The idea that anything that's going on in our government is not known to the Russians about the moment it happens is nonsense. The minute the president leaves the White House, he is communication. My farm, 90 miles away from here, I can tell when he has left. Because the special communication system begins to operate. And much of it is buried in a mountain 15 miles from me. And the Russians are listening to it all and get every message. Now, I'll have to get up. The dominance of the administrative system and the elections is by private power today. Money flows and corporation activities. And I just want to read you a summary from James Willard Hurst, The Legitimacy of the Business Corporation and the Law of the United States from 1780 to 1970. He points out that there was powerful anti-corporation feeling in the United States today. And among other things, it was established that no corporation could exist by prescription. That is, they had to have a charter. That they had to have a limited term of life and not be immortal. Corporations today are immortal. They got a charter, they can live forever and bury us all. That they have to have a limited purpose. In other words, they have to state it. Who is it giving us this bread that's made out of sawdust? ITT, International Telegraph and Telephone. The same corporation that drove Ida Kruger to suicide in Paris in April 1931, when it was an international telegraph corporation controlled by J.P. Morgan at that time. I won't take time to read these things, but certain things were established in the United States regarding corporations. Of course, it was on a state level, because the control of corporations. Restricted purpose and activities, especially by banks and insurance companies. Prohibition on one corporation to hold the stock of another without specific statutory grant. We definitely should have that again. Limits on the span of the life of the corporation itself, requiring recurrent legislative scrutiny. Limits on total assets. User limits on new issues of capital, so that proportionate control of existing stockholders could be maintained. Limits on the votes allowed to any stockholder, regardless of the size of his holding, and so forth. By 1890, all of these had been destroyed by judicial interpretation, which extended to corporations, fictitious persons, those constitutional rights guaranteed, especially in the 15th Amendment, to living persons. Because Roscoe Conkling, known as Turkey Strut Conkling, came to the Supreme Court and he said there were no records kept of the committee of the Senate which drew up the 15th Amendment, but he had kept private notes which showed that they intended the word person to include corporations. It was most convenient. The corporation that was hiring him to do this suitably rewarded him. Now we come to the last statement. And I regret ending on such a, I suppose, pessimistic. I'm not personally pessimistic. The final result will be that the American people will prefer, ultimately, communities. They will cop out or opt out of the system. Now, it'll be a long time. The system today consists of, well, I've given it to you, but everything is a bureaucratic structure, and brainwashed people who are not personalities are trained to fit into this bureaucratic structure and say this was a great life. Although I would assume that many on their deathbeds must feel otherwise. Notice, we are already on a wholesale basis copping out of military service. We are already on a large-scale basis copping out of voting. An estimate tonight was that the president will probably be chosen by 40% of the people eligible to vote. And that for the fourth time over 16 years, the percentage of voters who were registered who didn't vote will be higher. They also are copping out by no longer paying any attention to newspapers or what's going on, and by increasing emphasis on the growth of localism. What is happening in your own neighborhood? In this pathetic election, I am simply amazed that neither of the candidates has thought about any of the important issues such as localism. The rights of areas to make their own decisions about what goes on. Now, I realize that there's a sulfur mine or a sulfur factory out a couple of miles away that you can't do much about it, the localism. But I think you may find at this election one rather extraordinary thing. A considerable number of people who go to the polls and vote for the local candidates but do not vote for the president, which is the reverse of what it used to be 50 years ago. Now, I want to say good night. Do not be pessimistic. Life goes on. Life is fun. And if a civilization crashes, it deserves it. When Rome fell, the Christian answer was create our own communities.